The night was quiet, but it carried with it a tension that felt like electricity in the air. In the vast, unforgiving waters of the Pacific during World War II, thousands of miles away from the comforts of home, Japanese convoys moved cautiously under the cover of darkness. They had grown accustomed to the dangers lurking in these waters: American submarines, torpedoes, and air raids that struck like lightning from the skies. Yet nothing could have prepared them for what was about to happen. Within just 15 minutes, 8 ships, vessels filled with supplies, weapons, and men, would be obliterated in a storm of fire and metal. And the attackers? Low-flying American B-25 Mitchell bombers, strafing the sea with relentless fury, in a raid so shocking that Japanese sailors described it as if the sky itself had turned into a killing machine. To understand how such devastation could unfold in such a short span of time, we have to step back and trace the path that brought these bombers to the Pacific. The B-25 was not just any aircraft. It was rugged, versatile, and could be modified into different roles. Originally designed as a medium bomber, it became famous in 1942 during the Doolittle Raid, when 16 of them launched on the deck of a USS Hornet to strike Tokyo. That daring attack had not destroyed Japan's war machine, but it proved something more powerful than bombs could achieve: that Japan itself was vulnerable. It was a psychological strike, and it sent shockwaves through Japanese command. But as the war dragged deeper into the Pacific theater, the B-25 evolved into something much more terrifying for the Japanese Navy. Modified versions were armed with extra machine guns, rocket launchers, and sometimes even massive cannons mounted directly into the nose. These were not bombers in the traditional sense. They were flying gunships, designed to sweep low across enemy convoys and shred them with concentrated fire. American pilots nicknamed them Strafers, and when they roared just above the waves, their target stood little chance of survival. The Pacific War was as much about supply as it was about combat. Japan's empire stretched wide, from the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies, from Burma to the Solomon Islands. To maintain this vast domain, Japan needed constant streams of resources: oil, food, ammunition, and troops. These supplies came by sea. Convoys of cargo vessels and transport ships, escorted by destroyers and patrol boats, tried to move under the watchful eyes of the Imperial Navy. But by 1943 and 1944, the Allies had learned that breaking these supply lines could choke Japan's war effort. Every ship sunk meant fewer bullets at the front, fewer reinforcements, and a weakening empire. The Americans developed specialized tactics to make this happen. Instead of traditional high-altitude bombing, which often missed moving ships, pilots were trained to skim just above the waves, coming in low and fast. The goal was to catch convoys off guard, strafing them with machine gun fire, dropping bombs at mast height, and leaving chaos in their wake before the enemy could mount defense. The B-25 Strafers became the perfect tool for this deadly art of war. The Japanese, however, were not unaware of the danger. By this point in the war, they had already endured catastrophic losses at Midway, in the Solomons, and across countless naval engagements. They had seen the power of American airstrikes. But there was a cruel twist in their fate. Japan's ability to defend its convoys was deteriorating. Escort ships were too few in number. Air cover was stretched thin. Anti-aircraft fire could be devastating, but when American pilots came in low, hugging the ocean surface, those guns often fired too late or too inaccurately. Imagine being a sailor on one of those Japanese transports, glancing up at the horizon and spotting faint specks growing larger with every second. At first, perhaps you mistake them for patrol aircraft or even seagulls against the haze. But then the roar begins, the low, menacing growl of engines pushing their limits, echoing across the water. You see the glint of sunlight off metal, the silhouettes of wings slicing through the sky. And then, before your brain can even register the danger, tracers rip across the waves like fiery arrows. For the Americans, every second of such an attack was calculated chaos. The pilots had to fly dangerously low, skimming the sea so closely that a single mistake could plunge them into the ocean. Their gunners opened fire before the ship's defenders even had time to aim. Bombs were dropped in quick succession, timed perfectly to strike at water level, where the blast would tear open the thin hulls of cargo vessels. Fires erupted, fuel tanks exploded, and within moments, the convoy was engulfed in smoke and flames. In one such attack, the kind that stunned the Japanese, a squadron of B-25s approached a convoy moving through the Pacific. In less than a quarter of an hour, 8 ships were either sunk or left burning wrecks. The survivors would later recall the horror of those minutes. 15 minutes that felt like an eternity, as death rained from the sky in a hail of bullets and shrapnel. But this wasn't just destruction for its own sake. These attacks were part of a broader Allied strategy, a relentless campaign to strangle Japan's lifelines. And as the months went by, the Japanese would learn just how vulnerable they were to this new breed of warfare. Their convoys could no longer move safely, even under the cover of night. Every journey became a gamble with fate. Still, to fully grasp the magnitude of what happened in those 15 minutes, we must dive deeper. Who were the men flying these aircraft? How did they perfect such daring tactics? And what exactly happened during that unforgettable assault that left the Japanese so shaken? The answers lie in the stories of the pilots, the ingenuity of American engineers, and the desperate circumstances of a war fought over endless stretches of ocean. This is a story of how, in a single electrifying burst of violence, a handful of American B-25 Strafers turned the tide against an entire convoy, and why the Japanese never forgot the day the skies came alive with fire. The convoy had left port with confidence. Its cargo holds were filled with food, ammunition, and precious oil destined for Japanese forces fighting on remote islands. To the men aboard, this was supposed to be another dangerous but routine journey. They knew American submarines stalked the waters, and they feared torpedoes sliding silently beneath the waves. But the sky above, they believed, was still their shield. That illusion was shattered in the early morning haze. On the horizon, dark specks appeared, growing larger, faster than anyone could comprehend. The convoy's lookouts shouted warnings, but by the time the alarm spread across the ships, the attack was already in motion. Flying in tight formation, the American B-25 Strafers hurtled toward the convoy at barely 200 feet above the water. The sun glinted off their wings, the thunder of their engines rattled windows, and within seconds, the air was alive with the deafening roar of machine gun fire. Each bomber was bristling with as many as 14 forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns. Mounted in the nose, on the sides, and in the top turret, these guns spat fire that cut across the decks of Japanese transports like a storm of molten steel. Sailors scrambled for their anti-aircraft weapons, but many were cut down before they could even shoulder their rifles. The Strafers had been designed for exactly this purpose, overwhelming a target with so much firepower that defenses collapsed before they had time to react. One by one, the bombers swooped in at mast height, so close to the ocean that their propellers seemed to slice the spray from the waves. From this angle, they unleashed a combination of bombs and machine gun fire that turned the convoy into chaos. Bombs skipped across the water's surface, slamming into hulls with devastating effect. Explosions rocked the transport ships, sending towers of water and fire high into the air. On one vessel, the first salvo ignited the cargo hold. Black smoke poured skyward as ammunition inside began to cook off, detonating in a chain reaction that ripped the ship apart from within. Another transport, struck amidships, rolled heavily to one side before capsizing, its crew leaping desperately into flames and wreckage. In the span of only a few minutes, the convoy that had left port with order and purpose dissolved into a nightmare of wreckage, oil slicks, and men struggling in the water. From above, the American pilots could see everything. They had been trained to fly low, to keep moving, and to deliver their firepower with precision. They knew they couldn't linger. Every second over the convoy increased the risk of being shot down. But their attack was so sudden, so overwhelming, that the Japanese defenders could barely fire back. The few bursts of anti-aircraft fire that did rise into the sky were wild, desperate shots, aimed more at driving the attackers away than bringing them down. The Americans were not just lucky. They had developed a brutal efficiency in these strikes. Months earlier, tactical commanders had realized that strafing attacks against shipping required coordination and speed. Pilots were drilled to come in waves, each aircraft focusing its guns and bombs on a specific target, then pulling up just enough to clear the mast before circling for another pass. This meant that for the convoy below, there was no respite. One bomber after another screamed in low, each run adding to the destruction. In this particular attack, 8 ships were claimed in just 15 minutes. To those watching from the water, it must have felt as though the Americans had an endless supply of aircraft, raining death with mechanical precision. Fire spread from one ship to another, igniting fuel slicks that burned across the surface of the sea. Sailors trapped in the inferno had no choice but to jump overboard, only to find themselves surrounded by burning oil. Survivors later described the sky as alive with flames, a phrase that echoed in Japanese reports of the raid. But how could a medium bomber, originally intended for high-altitude strikes, become such a devastating weapon against shipping? The answer lies in American ingenuity and necessity. The B-25 was tough, reliable, and plentiful. Engineers realized that by stripping out unnecessary weight and loading the nose with guns, they could turn it into something resembling a flying battleship. Some versions even carried a 75mm cannon in the nose, capable of blasting holes in steel hulls. Though that weapon was cumbersome, the mast machine guns proved perfect for suppressing deck crews and chewing through thin-skinned transports. Pilots loved the aircraft's ability to take punishment. Stories spread of B-25s limping back to base with engines shredded, wings torn, and holes big enough for a man to crawl through. Its versatility gave commanders confidence that it could survive low-level missions where other bombers might be torn apart. For the Japanese, this meant that no convoy was safe, not in open water, not near their own shores, and not even under escort. The tactics themselves drew inspiration from earlier campaigns. The concept of skip bombing, bouncing bombs across the water like stones until they slammed into a ship's side, proved deadly effective. Combined with strafing runs, it created a 1-2 punch. Machine guns kept defenders' heads down while the bombs did their work. This marriage of precision and aggression turned the B-25 into one of the most feared sights in the Pacific. The shock of such raids reverberated far beyond the wreckage. For Japan, losing 8 ships in 15 minutes was not merely a tactical defeat. It was a strategic disaster. Every convoy lost meant vital supplies failed to reach frontline troops. Oil shortages deepened. Ammunition stockpiles dwindled. And soldiers in remote garrisons, already starving and exhausted, were left even more isolated. From the perspective of American pilots, the raid was a vindication of their training and their courage. They knew how dangerous low-level attacks could be. A single lucky burst of fire could rip through a fuel tank or engine, sending a bomber into the sea. But they also knew that striking convoys in this way was one of the fastest ways to bleed Japan's war machine dry. Many pilots admitted later that the sight of ships erupting under their guns filled them with a grim sense of satisfaction. Every vessel destroyed meant the war might end sooner, and fewer of their comrades would die on the beaches and jungles below. The Japanese, on the other hand, were stunned. Reports of the attack spread quickly, and sailors whispered about the terrifying efficiency of the American Strafers. Some even believed they had been attacked by an entirely new type of aircraft. So fierce and sudden was the onslaught. For men who had grown up with the image of Japan's Navy as the shield of the empire, the realization that their convoys could be annihilated in mere minutes was almost too much to comprehend. What made these strikes all the more devastating was their frequency. This was not an isolated incident. All across the Pacific, from the Bismarck Sea to the Philippines, convoys were ambushed, transport sent to the bottom, and supplies cut off. The 15-minute massacre was only one episode in a much larger campaign of destruction that left Japan gasping for breath. And yet, even amid the wreckage, there were stories of survival, of sailors who clung to debris for hours before being rescued, of pilots who returned with bullet holes peppering their fuselages, of moments where death was inches away, but somehow passed by. These accounts add a human dimension to what could otherwise feel like a cold tally of ships sunk and tons of cargo destroyed. The true weight of the story lies not only in the 8 ships lost, but in what it symbolized. The collapse of Japan's ability to protect its lifelines, the rise of American dominance in the skies, and the sheer speed with which modern warfare could obliterate centuries-old traditions of naval supremacy. The sea boiled with fire. Black smoke coiled upward, blotting out the morning sun, while burning oil spread across the waves in a slick of flames. For 15 minutes, the air had been filled with the roar of engines, the crack of gunfire, and the thunder of explosions. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the attack was over. The American B-25 Strafers pulled away, their engines fading into the distance, leaving behind a watery graveyard where a proud convoy had once sailed. The silence that followed was heavy and cruel. Survivors clung to floating debris, coughing to the choking smoke, their ears ringing from the deafening barrage. Some screamed for shipmates who would never answer. Others tried desperately to swim clear of the spreading fires. The sea itself turned into a burning trap. Destroyers that had survived the onslaught rushed to pick up survivors. But even they were crippled, their decks torn by bullets and their guns smashed by relentless strafing. For the Japanese sailors who lived through those 15 minutes, it was a nightmare they would carry for the rest of their lives. But for the Americans, the scene they left behind was not only destruction, it was triumph. The pilots knew they had dealt a staggering blow. 8 ships gone in a quarter of an hour. In the larger scale of the war, this was more than a tactical victory. It was a symbol, proof of the Allies' growing mastery of the Pacific. Japan had once sailed these waters as if they owned them. Their fleets feared across half the globe. Now, even their convoys were little more than sitting ducks for American air power. The climax of this story is not just the attack itself, but what it represented. This raid was part of a broader turning point. By the time of this assault, Japan's navy had already been crippled in major battles. Midway had cost them carriers they could never replace. The Solomon Islands had bled them of men and aircraft. Now, with their convoy routes under constant threat, they faced a new enemy: starvation, fuel shortages, and the slow strangulation of their empire. Every ship that went down meant that thousands of soldiers in the Philippines, New Guinea, or the Solomons would fight with fewer bullets, less rice, and dwindling hope. It meant that oil from the Dutch East Indies, once the lifeblood of Japan's war machine, could not reach the fuel tanks of planes and ships. In war, logistics is often invisible, but it decides everything. A starving army cannot fight. A navy without fuel cannot sail. And an empire cut off from its resources is an empire already doomed. The B-25 Strafers became legends in this silent war against supply lines. Pilots recalled the exhilaration of the low-level runs, but also the terror. Flying so close to the waves meant that a single mistake, a moment of turbulence, or a burst of enemy fire could end in disaster. Some missions saw entire crews lost at the sea, and yet they kept flying, raid after raid, because they knew the effect was devastating. One fascinating detail about these strafing missions is the precision required. Unlike high-altitude bombing, where bombs scatter over wide areas, low-level attacks demanded nerves of steel and exact timing. Pilots had to release bombs at just the right moment for them to skip across the water and strike a ship's hull. Release too early and the bombs would fall short. Too late and they would overshoot. It was a deadly art, honed through training and sharpened in combat. The Japanese were stunned not only by the destruction, but by the audacity of it. Reports describe how the Americans seemed to defy death, flying so low that their planes were almost touching the sea. One Japanese officer, writing after the war, compared to watching hawks swoop down on helpless prey. The speed, the firepower, the precision, it was unlike anything they had imagined when the war began. And yet, in those 15 minutes of carnage, there is also a human story. The young Japanese sailors, many barely out of their teens, who found themselves staring up at the sky in horror as streams of fire cut across their decks. The American crews, men in their 20s, focused on their instruments, their hearts pounding as they held their aircraft steady under withering fire. Each side lived moments of unimaginable intensity, bound together by the same brutal reality: survival. The destruction of 8 ships in such a short span became a story that spread quickly. For the Allies, it was celebrated as a textbook example of what air power could achieve when wielded with precision and daring. Newspapers back home reported on the success, often with a tone of pride, though the full horror of what it meant for those in the convoy was left to the imagination. For Japan, it was a tale of shock and despair, a sign that their once mighty empire was slipping beyond rescue. As the Pacific War marched on, raids like this one multiplied. Convoys became rarer, and when they did sail, they were smaller and more heavily guarded. But even then, American air dominance often proved too overwhelming. By late 1944, Japan's logistical network was collapsing entirely. Factories lacked materials, soldiers went hungry, and warships were abandoned in harbors with empty fuel tanks. The seeds of that collapse had been planted in attacks like the 15-minute massacre of 8 ships. Looking back, it is hard not to feel the weight of those minutes. On one hand, they were a triumph of skill, bravery, and innovation. American pilots and engineers had transformed a medium bomber into a fearsome weapon, and in doing so, they hastened the end of a brutal conflict. On the other hand, those minutes were filled with human tragedy. The screams of men trapped below decks, the terror of sailors leaping into burning seas, the silence of lives extinguished in an instant. History often remembers the victories and the numbers. 8 ships destroyed, 15 minutes, 1 squadron of B-25s. But behind those numbers are countless stories that were never told. The families in Japan who never saw their sons again. The air crews who came home but carried memories of fire and death for the rest of their lives. The war in the Pacific was not just fought on battlefields or in grand naval clashes. It was fought in moments like this, sudden and violent, where fate turned in the span of seconds. As the war drew to its close, many Japanese sailors who had survived such attacks reflected on the sense of helplessness they felt. They had entered the Navy believing in the strength of the Empire and the invincibility of their fleets. But by 1944 and 1945, that illusion had been burned away. Convoys became death traps, every journey a gamble. The Americans had seized the initiative, and there was no turning back. And so, the memory of those 15 minutes stands as a symbol of the wider war. It was not the largest battle of the Pacific, nor the most famous, but it encapsulated the essence of the conflict. Speed, surprise, devastation, and the relentless march of American power against a crumbling empire. In the smoke and fire of that convoy's destruction, one can see the story of the Pacific War itself. The rise of air power, the collapse of Japanese supply lines, and the terrible human cost that lay beneath every victory. When the last fires burned out, and the last survivors were pulled from the sea, the ocean swallowed the evidence. But history remembers. The day when 8 ships were destroyed in 15 minutes lives on as a reminder of how quickly the tides of war can turn, and how, in the crucible of combat, minutes can change the fate of nations.